The governor himself has called ICE the Gestapo and has compared federal law enforcement to Nazis. I mean, this is the rhetoric that's happened in our own state. And we can usually point to the other side or one side and say that to blame, but this has been happening on both sides. And to be, truth be told, I get sick and tired of hearing it as well. I want to tone down. I want to see that rhetoric toned down. And I really want to get back to the issues at hand here.
Now let's plug into the continuing heated argument about law enforcement on immigration law in the United States and the way that has flared into something so very serious. The epicenter of this is, of course, Minneapolis in the state of Minnesota. And a chief judge there has ordered the head of the ICE federal agency to appear in court, saying the Trump administration failed to comply with orders requiring hearings for detained migrants. Just in the last hour, the former President Joe Biden has been writing on social media. He says, and I'm quoting, "What's unfolded in Minneapolis this last month betrays our most basic values as Americans. We're not a nation that guns down our citizens in the street. We're not a nation that allows our citizens to be brutalized for exercising their constitutional rights. No single person," says Biden, "can destroy what America stands for and believes in, not even a president. If we all of America stand up and speak out, we know who we are. It's time to show the world. More importantly, it's time to show ourselves." So let me first turn to and get the thoughts of Mike Wiener, the Minnesota state representative in the Republican Party. Hello to you, Mike. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me on today.
Good to have you. Looking back to what happened yesterday in the White House, we did see, didn't we, President Trump declining to repeat claims about the intensive care nurse who was shot dead by federal agents, Alex Pretty. Previously, a member of the administration, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, said he was an urban terrorist, said that he'd set about murdering federal agents. That was another member of the team in the White House. Are you glad the president has not gone down that path, at least now?
Well, I'm glad to see that Governor Walz and the president are actually communicating, because I think this is important. We need to tone down the rhetoric, but we also need to look at the reason that we're in this issue, because we've had millions of illegals coming across the border for years, unchecked immigration. And truth be told, I'm in support of legal immigration. We want to have people come here and make a better life for themselves. But what happened, unfortunately, when our border was wide open, was there was so many criminals that had access to our country. And now, unfortunately, we have to go and find out where these criminals are. Yeah. And the situation here in Minnesota really comes down to the sanctuary policy that protected criminals and created this situation, this conflict with the federal government, who has to enforce those immigration laws.
And when you say there's a need to tone down the language, do you include in that Kristi Noem, the Director of Homeland Security? She made these claims. She said that Alex Pretty was an urban terrorist, that he was setting out to murder ICE federal agents. And that was, of course, as we've seen, being contradicted by a massive video evidence. Now, what do you think of that? Did anything that she said on that count as appropriate? Is it right that she seems to have lost overall control of the operation?
Well, and we've seen this on both sides. When the governor of our state, and for the federal level, I have very little contact, very little interaction with them. But my own state here, when the governor himself has called ICE the Gestapo and has compared federal law enforcement to Nazis. I mean, this is the rhetoric that's happened in our own state. And we can usually point to the other side or one side and say that to blame, but this has been happening on both sides. And to be, truth be told, I get sick and tired of hearing it as well. I want to tone down. I want to see that rhetoric toned down. And I really want to get back to the issues at hand here.
Okay, look, I mean, you do refer to the need, as you see it, for both sides to tone down the language. I would fully expect you to make that point about your political opponents and the governor of the state, the mayor of Minneapolis, but you do seem to be aiming that at your own side, as it were, your own political side in the United States too. Look, when you talk about what the governor of the state said about the ICE agents, the enforcement agencies on immigration law, so-called ICE agents, we have all seen, Mike, the video footage, a lot of it, of agents dragging people from their cars, sometimes smashing their windows, demanding identification and exceeding the powers, as far as I can see, they're granted clearly by law. What do you make of that conduct? Because that has had an inflammatory effect too. You would accept, wouldn't you, surely, even as a Republican supporter of tough immigration law?
Nobody wants to see law enforcement go out of their bounds, obviously.
And that has been happening. You accept that?
With that being said, when I look at what's happened in this state, if the state government had cooperated with ICE to begin with, we wouldn't have this situation. ICE has had operations in many states across our country, many cities, and did not have this level of conflict. And the reason for that is those entities, the governors, the state police, and so on and so forth, work with ICE. So when you have this conflict, we kind of got to look at both sides and say, is the conflict on one side or just on the other? And there's some responsibility on both sides. But I don't think it would have escalated to this point if we hadn't had the sanctuary policies in this state. And that's really kind of the biggest issue that I see.
Well, there's another big issue which I'm keen to get your thoughts on. I was speaking a little earlier on to a city councilman from the city of Minneapolis. He was telling me that the people of the city are walking around literally in fear of being molested and challenged and maltreated by federal agents. I've seen a good deal, as I say, of video footage of people testifying to exactly that effect. The idea of Americans who are legally in the country, minding, as it were, their own business and walking around the city in fear, that is a pretty awful thought, is it not?
Well, of course, nobody wants to see the citizens living in fear. But let's go back just a little bit and look at what the situation in Minneapolis was last summer with murder rates rising. Carjackings were astronomical. They were going through the roof. The lawlessness that was taking place and the citizens themselves that were living in fear at that time, that was horrible. So this has been going on for quite some time. Just to blame ICE for living in for the citizens living in fear isn't quite accurate, and it's not a complete picture. We've almost become, and I hate to say this, but Minneapolis has been kind of given the moniker of Murderapolis over the last few years because of the lawlessness that's taken place there.
All right, Mike Wiener, I'm going to leave it there for the time being. Thank you. Mike Wiener is a Republican representative for Minnesota State. Julia Decker now is with us, the policy director of the Immigrant Law Center in Minnesota. Hi to you, Julia.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Can I put to you, Julia, a point that was just made by the Republican representative for the state? He was saying that the authorities in Minneapolis and of the state of Minnesota could and should cooperate more closely with federal operations to identify and remove illegal migrants, because he says that is about enforcing the law. And I do see opinion polls that say most people in America, most voters, do want to see immigration law enforced. What do you say to that as a way of dialing down the tension?
Sure. So I would first note, Immigrant Law Center, we are a nonpartisan organization, so
Sure.
We are not a party-affiliated organization. But I would note that, immigration law is, by definition, a federal entity. It's a federal law function. And so when we talk about immigration law enforcement, that is ultimately a responsibility of the federal government. And so when we talk about wanting state and local law enforcement agencies to cooperate with the federal immigration authorities, what we are essentially asking under the United States system would be to ask them to put their resources towards doing the federal government's job, or to help the federal government do its job for it. And that really runs up against some very baseline bedrock constitutional principles of federalism.
Right. Okay. Look, I've seen it argued, and I wonder if you'll be echoing this position yourself. You may well do that we're seeing the federal agency ICE enforcing immigration law just exceeding the boundaries of their legal powers. Swooping on people, taking people while they're in the process of having their right to stay in the United States processed through the legal system. A talk of stopping people and demanding their identity in circumstances where that cannot be justified, in ways that cannot be justified. Now, if these things, as it's often pointed out, are against the law, what about the courts? The courts are there to ensure the law is followed.
Yes, I think this is a real concern. And I think that is why we are seeing, of course, lots of court cases and litigation being brought around some of these instances of stops and people being arrested and detained on, potentially problematic and potentially even unconstitutional grounds. The outcomes of those cases, of course, in a lot of cases remains to be seen. And one of the more maybe existential questions right now is, even if there is a finding and a sort of ruling that the federal government should stop doing these things, what is the sort of mechanism to enforce that? What happens if the federal agents decide to keep doing things in violation of those court orders? What then?
Yeah, well, then it's up to the courts to enforce their own orders with appropriate sanctions. But we'll see how that pans out, because there's more than one case before the courts now. For now, Julia Decker at the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, thank you for joining me.